Oops. Okay, good. So we will begin today's Cold War Studies seminar. I want to welcome everyone here today on Groundhog Day. I cite Groundhog Day not only because it is the 2nd of February, but also it was the name of the title of the film that came out, I guess, about 25 years ago. And for those who haven't seen it, it's basically about a journalist played by Bill Murray who has to repeat the day over and over again. For today's seminar, we actually planned to hold it almost a year ago. So the preparations and the like, we are repeating again, probably won't have to ad infinitum, but the book that is the topic of today's seminar came out in 2019, and we were planning to look at it shortly after it was published to have the author come to Cambridge and actually present it. Because of the pandemic, we're doing it instead by today's Zoom seminar. So I am very pleased to welcome someone to the seminar who will, someone I've known since the early 1990s. Although I was familiar with his name, Samuel F. Wells Jr., prior to that, because I had read when I was a graduate student in the mid-1980s, I had read a very important article he had published in the journal International Security, which at that time was a relatively new journal, but was already a highly regarded journal in the field of international relations and international security. And he published an article there in the autumn of 1979 called Sounding the Tocsin, NSC-68 and the Soviet Threat. And what he did there was to draw on newly released US documents that allowed him to go back and assess the role of NSC-68, a document that was drafted in the State Department under the leadership of Paul Nitze, and that probably wouldn't have had all that much long-term impact had it not been for the singular impact of the Korean War. And that's what that article does in looking at the US side of the Korean War and how it affected subsequent US policy. Now, at that time, there were no documents available from the Soviet bloc or from China, and especially North Korea, and for that matter, South Korea. So the scope of that article was limited solely to the US side. And it was quite critical of NSC-68 and some of the subsequent developments. I mentioned all that mainly because the book that is the topic of today's seminar, Fearing the Worst, how Korea transformed the Cold War. It looks at the Korean War in a much wider perspective, drawing on a great volume of documents that have emerged from almost all of the participating countries. North Korea would be the major exception, but and it is a major exception because that is a country that is known really only from Soviet bloc, Chinese and Soviet bloc documents. So we still are fairly limited. But Sam has shown how what he sought to do with the US side in that article of 41 years ago, 42 years ago, now, 40, over 40 years ago, was can now be done for all of the sides in the Korean War. So he looks in the book, he divides it into two main parts in which he provides the context for how the Korean War began, and then looks at the war itself. And then in the second part, looks at the transformative impact of the war on the Cold War itself, the larger Cold War. He has changed some of his judgments about US policy as compared to the article of 1979, and so he undoubtedly will touch on that today. But the major feature of the book is that it now does for the whole Cold War, all sides of it, what he did in 1979. Sam himself, I want to just give a very brief biographical sketch. He was instrumental in the founding of the International Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., one of the few centers of that sort in Washington, perhaps the only one that I wouldn't describe as a think tank per se. It really is an academic organization, a genuine bastion of scholarship in Washington, D.C., which is very unusual because most of the think tanks are mostly interested in having an impact on policy. Now, the Woodrow Wilson Center does have that, but it is also committed to genuine scholarship. And so Sam was at various points deputy director of the Woodrow Wilson Center and associate director. Now he has stepped down from those posts and is remains a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and had the opportunity after stepping down to really focus on writing this book. He has produced work on numerous other topics that I won't go into here because I want to give him ample time first to present the book and then to respond to questions. So with that, let me turn to Sam.
Thank you, Mark. It's a very nice setup for what I want to say, because there's really nothing like getting huge new batches of documents to brighten the eyes of a serious researcher. And starting with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we got a lot of documents, and many of those documents dealt with the Korean War period and gave reports from Pyongyang or Beijing or other places that could help let us see what's referred to as the other side of the Cold War. That forced me to both do a lot of additional work, but also to revise a lot of my thinking and conclusions, particularly with regard to the amount of risk and investment that the authorities in Moscow and Beijing chose to invest in this war. And with every indication that they would continue to invest it on the line of policy that took them there. So let me start by looking at one of the oddities, at least to me, of the way the Korean War itself is viewed in the three principal combatant capitals. In the United States, very little attention is paid to the Korean War. It's viewed as an uncelebrated stalemate, or in a frequently used phrase, a forgotten war. China sees it very differently. They see it as a glorious victory. And in a recent speech celebrating the 70th anniversary of China's entry into the war in October of 1950, President Xi Jinping made frequent references to the People's Volunteers' defeat of the more heavily armed American aggressors. And he made quite a splash in giving an implicit threat to the United States, saying, don't push us too far. We know how to respond to strong statements and power policies, such as our attempt to pressure the North Koreans and indeed in some other ways the Chinese. In Russia, for example, the war is, by contrast, almost completely ignored. From the very start, the Russians contended that they were not involved in the war. And this despite the fact that it was Stalin alone who authorized it, who ordered his military to provide the strategy and the tactics, and had advisors down to battalion level with all of the invading forces, and ended up supplying almost all of the supplies used by the Chinese and North Korean forces. So that's how the peoples of the three countries, when they read narratives written there, tend to learn about the war. Well, in fact, when you get into the new documents that are available over the last 20, 25 years, you find out quite a different story. Let me give some of the highlights and leave time for you to raise questions where you want. One of the key things is that why did Stalin decide to back this invasion? He turned down, account varies, it depends on which sources and how far you go back. But from the time Kim Il-sung took over the full control of the government in North Korea, he began requesting, hinting, urging Stalin to allow him to invade South Korea and unify the country under communism, and to provide the supplies to do it, because he didn't have the weapons or the supplies necessary. Every time Stalin refused. Only in January of 1950, when Mao was in Beijing, engaged in a very tough series of conversations with Stalin, did Stalin reverse his policy. And he did so for a variety of reasons that we can go into, but certainly important among them were the fact that the Soviet Union now had tested successfully an atomic bomb. They were on the way to building a force of bombers that could reach the United States. They had an excellent espionage system in the United States and knew what was being proposed before the National Security Council almost as quickly as Truman knew it himself. And what Mao was proposing was not a terrible blow to the Soviet system in Asia, because Mao wanted to regain the concessions that had been made at Yalta to the Soviets by the Chinese nationalists. And those were, while important, not critical. What Stalin saw that led him to completely flip his approach to the North Korean request was a complex scheme that many would have thought he wasn't capable of at that time, because he was 70 years old and had multiple health problems, was frequently not as cogent as he had been in previous years. But this was a very clever calculation. The United States had made it clear that it would not include Korea within its defense perimeter. We didn't say we wouldn't defend South Korea, but we strongly implied that. Our troops were withdrawn. If Kim could meet his promises, it would provide a communist client state in control of the whole Korean peninsula. This would slow down any Japanese revival and return to the continent of Asia. It would give him the warm water ports that he wanted and that he would be giving up with concessions to Mao. So basically, at very little cost, Stalin thought, I can endorse this invasion, provide as many supplies as are really essential, and force Kim to get Mao's endorsement and support of this plan. Now that's the key, because after he invited Kim Il-sung to come to Moscow, he said to him, you have to get Mao's endorsement and agreement to support you if things go badly. Kim didn't think anything of that. He was young, ambitious, even arrogant. And he thought his prediction was he could win the war in Korea within 7 days. That the Soviet military advisors didn't think that was plausible, but they thought maybe in 3 weeks he could. So that's what led to the approval of the war. Now, when Kim went to talk with Mao about it, Mao, being suspicious of Stalin from the difficult negotiations and the way in which Stalin had treated him as a supplicant from an impoverished country. And so he had his right-hand man, Zhou Enlai, send a cable immediately to Moscow, to Stalin, saying, what did you promise Kim? And what's our supposed role in this? And Stalin sent back a fairly vague answer and said, in effect, that if Kim gets into trouble, you have to bail him out. But that's not likely to happen. So, not to worry, in effect. So that's the way the war started. The invasion occurs. South Koreans aren't well prepared. And the Chinese are watching cautiously. Well, it turns out that the revolt that Kim had hoped would come from a group of supposed communists in central South Korea did not occur. So there was no uprising in the back of the front. The president of South Korea had actually cleaned up and killed many of these supposed communists, who were roughly numbering 200,000. And many others were in detention or forced into the military to fight. They had a choice, Hobson's choice of join the military or we'll line you up in the firing line. So the invasion didn't go as expected and so forth. So the Chinese then started making preparations to protect their border and to intervene if necessary. And as of really the second week in July, Mao Zedong has made a decision, a personal decision, that China will have to intervene in the war, if only to clear up the final remnants of what was by then United Nations resistance, because the United States had gotten UN endorsement to restore peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. So the war goes on. It's stalemated roughly around the Pusan perimeter. The Americans get reinforcements there, and eventually General MacArthur makes a very daring and risky amphibious assault on the port of Incheon, which is right at south of the border, close to Seoul. And then he completely collapses the North Korean forces and starts a drive toward the border with China. And it's a very risky drive, and he doesn't have the logistical and the actual military strength to deal with it. And we seriously underestimate the chances of Chinese intervention. When the United States and UN forces are approaching the border with China at the Yalu River, the Chinese infiltrate some 400,000 men and then spring a surprise attack, driving the Americans back. So this goes on through the winter of 1950-51, and by the late winter, the United Nations forces have regained the offensive and start moving back up the peninsula. And at this point, our allies, particularly the British, get very nervous that we could drive all the way to the border and be in a war with the Chinese and use nuclear weapons, which MacArthur was threatening to do. And they really panicked and sent a delegation to Washington to try and turn it around. In the meantime, the Americans do a reassessment of what fighting an army of close to 1.5 million Chinese soldiers by that time would entail. And they decide that a negotiated settlement at a defensible border just north of the 38th parallel would be acceptable. So that's the development of the American strategy. In the meantime, what has happened is what Mark referred to as part 2 of the book, which is the transformation of American policy for international affairs and the military strength to carry it out. The diplomatic side involves very adroit action by Dean Acheson to assist in the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, which brings France and Germany together, and then move very quickly to try and give the Allied occupied zones a cohesive national recognition in the form of creating the Federal Republic of Germany. He had major French help in doing this. And then of course, just prior to the breakout of the war, the NATO alliance is established, but it's just essentially a political alliance of reassurance for the Europeans, not a functioning military alliance. What the Korean War does is to make that into a totally functioning military alliance. And it does so really by expanding the defense budget by many times, by doubling the size of the Army and the military, increasing particularly the Strategic Air Command from 48 groups of bombers to 83. The defense budget goes from 13 billion to 60 billion by 1952. The size of the CIA grows by 6 times in its covert action capabilities, and its budget grows by at least 4 times. There's a huge expansion of the whole intelligence system, which had been in complete disarray and fractured among a dozen plus different agencies. So the buildup is significant. There is also a significant nuclear component to it. We greatly expand the production of nuclear weapons. Now, the other point that I'd like to make in terms of the transformation of the Cold War is that with the outbreak of the war, Stalin pays attention really for the first time to a small nuclear weapons program that he had initiated in 1946. And this program, run by Igor Kurchatov, gets a green light for virtually anything they need in a critical meeting that's held in 1950. And Kurchatov, I'm sorry, in late 1946, after the Soviets have really evaluated the effect of Hiroshima and what the nuclear weapons can do. A huge nuclear complex is built. There are half a dozen secret cities built in the east of the Urals, where uranium is purified, graphite is made for various weapons producing nuclear energy systems, and the Soviets began to produce quite a range of workable weapons. At the same time, one of their world famous airplane designers, Andrei Tupolev, is working on a bomber that can reach the continental United States. He goes through a number of real problems, but finally succeeds in getting one that can reach most areas of the United States. The problem with that is that it is completed only by the time the United States has a very effective radar detection system that was put up and a fleet of fast jet fighters that can take out are much faster than the plane that Tupolev had completed, so that his plane is essentially ineffective by the time it's completed. But the point was they invested immense resources in both the nuclear and the bomber programs. Our growing intelligence system figured that out, and the Truman administration decided we had to counter that in a big way, and that's what really fueled the subsequent appropriations for more bombers and more nuclear submarines and so forth. Now, when I look back at the Korean War and answer the kinds of questions that journalists have been putting to me for some months now, what was really the impact? What did this war accomplish? And I say, well, first of all, you have to think not about the Korean Peninsula alone. You have to put the Korean War in a global context, and that's what I've been talking about. And you realize that this buildup really is what commits the United States to an active international policy with the military force to back it up. Most of the assets from this big buildup go to Europe. Europe is, as it was in World War II, the first priority. But there are also significant commitments in Asia. We hastened a peace treaty with Japan. We created an alliance with Japan. We had been very upset with the government of South Korea. We create a real alliance with them, and we extend a partnership which had been really not existent at all with the nascent government of Taiwan, which had split off from the Chinese government when the nationalists were driven off the mainland. Now, this, of course, was a major irritant, a major aggression, actually, for the Chinese government. And they made it very clear that they would continue to try everything they could to regain Taiwan. And that is an issue that you can read about in the papers every other day now. So a few other things are worth mentioning as results of the war. It made the concept of limited war a viable option, although it's still criticized by those who insist on total victory, like the heirs of General MacArthur. It also established the principle in the US government of no first use of nuclear weapons. We could have simplified in some ways our military issue in Korea by the use of nuclear weapons, although the military pointed out to the civilian members of the National Security Council that by the time they were considering the use of nuclear weapons, and MacArthur was demanding it, there were no good targets for nuclear weapons because North Korea had been largely obliterated. When you look at the way in which the war was assessed, China was a significant beneficiary. It was taken seriously as a nation state and government, and it clearly became the leader, the first partner of communism in Asia. The biggest loser clearly were the Soviets, who had to make commitments in Asia that they had not wanted to do. They had irritated the North Koreans by not giving them adequate support in the fighting and backing the Chinese. And the Chinese were still irritated because they didn't send air support and sufficiently weapons to advance the war quickly enough. And finally, the war, with our limited war strategy, left North Korea intact as a state, barely existent as an economy. Kim Il-sung still in control, and with a desire to build up his military and, when possible, gain nuclear weapons of his own. So that desire comes from that. And after he gets, basically so that he can feed the country and has full political control again, he starts pushing the Soviets to give him, to train nuclear engineers and to set up a nuclear power program for North Korea. The Soviets resist for a while, but then start helping and eventually provide the assistance that allows the North Korean nuclear program that we are so concerned about today to begin development. So let me stop at that point, Mark.
Very good. Thank you very much, Sam. Let me mention for the audience, the book is about 600 pages long. It is a very rich, dense account of both the war, the context of the war itself, including extremely interesting discussions of some of the military commanders as well, like MacArthur, whom Sam mentioned, General Ridgway, Matthew Ridgway, and others. So for anyone who's interested in military history, you'll also find a great deal of material in the book. But the international politics, as well as the domestic politics of the war, come up in the first part especially. And then the second part deals with the impact on the Cold War, the short-term impact and medium-term, but also longer-term. It is a extremely rewarding book for anyone interested in international relations as well as the history of the Cold War. We were going to have copies of it on sale that we had the seminar a year ago, but since it's not in person now, let me just recommend anyone interested in getting a hold of the book can contact either Columbia University Press or Amazon.com or other such booksellers. So you'll find it readily available. There are already questions from the audience. I do want to raise one question, or at least I have quite a few questions, but having to do with the title, Sam, Fearing the Worst, which applies to, that actually could even be applied to some extent to the article that you wrote in 1979, but it still would be applicable, I think, to US policymakers. And in fact, I would argue it wasn't just true about the late 40s and early 50s. It applied to US policymakers throughout the Cold War until the very end, say after 1985. But there was one party in this story, though, who wasn't fearing the worst, and I'm picking up on a question raised by a member of the audience here, which was North Korea. Kim Il-sung clearly had a very buoyant view of what he could achieve. That is, as you mentioned, he thought he could win the war within a week, that North Korean forces would simply overwhelm the South, that there would be uprisings in the South. Now, that raises several questions. Why did he have these delusions, including about in South Korea, there had been periodic purges of communists and communist sympathizers who could have perhaps undertaken a supportive uprising. So what was it about Kim Il-sung, to the best we can judge? Because again, as we've discussed, there aren't North Korean documents. The only way we can judge Kim Il-sung's views is through his discussions with communist leaders and what we can learn in general from public statements. So why do you think the North Koreans were so buoyant? Especially, they obviously would have been aware that communists in South Korea were being removed throughout the latter half of the 1940s.
Well, I think he had, by all accounts that you get from defectors and reports from diplomats in North Korea, an unreasonable level of confidence in both his own leadership and his ability as a strategist, and the capability of his military. Now, before the Soviets started sending a lot of supplies in roughly March of 1950, when their advisors had been there for some time, the North Korean army was probably stronger than the South Korean army by almost a factor of 2. But a lot of that strength came in the fact that 100,000 of their troops had fought with Korean generals in the Chinese Civil War on the side of the Chinese communists. And they had been allowed in the very late months of 1949 and the early months of 1950 to return to North Korea with their weapons. And this gave Kim really the battle-hardened troops and leaders who had led them in that guerrilla-type war, which became more of a conventional war as they gained strength in the latter parts of the Chinese Civil War. And he really did have confidence on, there were, the history of the Communist Party in Korea shows that the majority of the Communist Party members in 1946, 47 were in the South. And the Communist Party was based in Seoul. That was the headquarters. And the leaders of the Communist Party were South Korean. And some of them had gone and moved to North Korea after the division. Others were just eliminated with considerable help of the Soviet advisors and intelligence operatives in North Korea. So it was not a rational calculation by any means that he could bring this off, but he did. He had come back to Korea in the latter part of 1945 as part of a Soviet division. And he was a captain, 36 years old. And he was picked up from that point by the political commissar, basically, of the Soviet forces that occupied North Korea. And he was selected as the one with the capabilities. Now, he returned, he spoke fluent Chinese and Russian, but his Korean was quite elementary. So he had succeeded in a very few years with very much Soviet help in eliminating his rivals, taking control of the Communist Party, learning Korean, and shaping up an army and getting a large number of people back from the Chinese Civil War. So there was some basis for him to think he might be able to bring it off, but when you try to do an order of battle comparison, it looks like a bit of a stretch. And when the Americans reversed their tentative decision not to have any forces in Korea and not to allow the Koreans to have any offensive weapons in South Korea, that created a very different situation. And once we were in, we gradually increased step by step our commitment to both defending South Korea and defeating the North Koreans.
Well, let me ask you, Sam, do you think, because Stalin obviously was very concerned about the prospect of US intervention, and as you discussed in the book, he asked Kim, when they met, he asked him about this several times and wanted to know genuinely whether there was a real prospect of US intervention. And Kim assured him that it wouldn't happen. Do you think Kim was deceiving him, or did he actually believe that? And that leads me to a question from the audience as well, which is how did Stalin's interactions with Kim affect later Soviet leaders' interactions with North Vietnamese leaders during the Vietnam War and Vietnamese communists? Did it make them more wary of what they were told, or did it have any discernible impact in that regard?
Well, I think Kim really believed the US wouldn't intervene. And you see, the calculation was based in large part on the fact that he assumed he could win this war and be all the way in control of all the territory before the US could get mobilized. We had no real organized combat units. We had occupation forces in Japan. We had disbanded almost all of the combat units down to just a command structure in many cases in the US. And we had several divisions in Europe. So our military posture was not in expectation of any kind of use for half a dozen years at least. That was the calculation in the planning documents in the Pentagon. It was a gamble, but it was a gamble on all three of the communist sides. And in many ways, Mao made the biggest gamble because he gambled that he could have an impact on the war and improve his standing and not have a bloody nose because the Soviets would provide most of the supplies. And while they didn't do it as quickly as they were needed, they eventually did supply the forces. And so Mao was able to hang on. But in the war's process, there were a lot of disputes between the Chinese commander and the North Koreans, and Kim in particular. And the Chinese went straight to Stalin and said, look, this whole Korean leadership is incompetent and arrogant. They don't know what they're doing. We can't run a coordinated operation unless there's one leadership. And he said, fine, you've got it. If the Chinese call the shots. Well, this really irritated the blazes out of Kim. And so the Chinese pushed sufficiently against the Russians. At one point, they weren't getting the kind of supplies they needed to push further for a new offensive. And they just pulled back and stopped. And at this point, Stalin was aware that the MacArthur team was urging bombing the air bases in Manchuria, which had a lot of Soviet mechanics, pilots, and so forth. The Chinese were flying the planes by this time. The Soviets had flown them initially. And Stalin saw that this could really get very messy if he didn't kick in. So he supplied more, but now that made them cautious, obviously later on in Vietnam. But what so many Americans don't understand is that from the creation of the People's Republic of China, the first place they turned was giving assistance to the Vietnamese, to the Viet Cong. Ho Chi Minh had worked with the Chinese communists during the Civil War. He went back with pledges from the Chinese that if they took over, they would help him, and they did. So the whole Vietnam situation became a bit of a competition between the Chinese and the Soviets over who would supply, and there are different factions, and they're each suspicious of all three are suspicious. So the same triangle of triangular mutual suspicions continues in Vietnam, or is created there. And it's something that in the Korean circumstance, I refer to as three scorpions in a bottle. And it's because they're all keeping an eye on the other two and not turning their backs in effect. So.
Very good. Thank you, Sam. Let me turn, even though I'm tempted to stay on the war itself, particularly to ask about some of the context in the United States. Let me turn, though, for want of time, to some of the impact. As you note in the book, and as you've noted in numerous places, that one of the ironies of the Korean War is that it had far-reaching effects in Europe, particularly on the United States and NATO, in the sense that it really made, as you described, the NATO had been initially just a political support organization, but not a real military alliance. Whereas one of the effects of the Korean War was to make NATO a real military alliance. So could you discuss that a bit? Is why the Korean War had that far-reaching impact in Europe? I should add that it was not only for the West, but also for the Soviet bloc. But anyway, let me turn.
Right. Well, in part, you see, it was because the people who were at the center of giving advice to Truman, who was one of the more interesting characters ever to occupy the White House. He had very little qualifications to be president or someone who would be running a major range of international policies. And he had a degree of confidence, both in himself and his ability to work with people a lot more experienced and smarter than he was, which he would immediately acknowledge. So he surrounded himself with really excellent people. And he had, a very good Secretary of the Treasury, whom he trusted and included on really all of the he was a member of the National Security Council and somebody he dealt with and drank with frequently. He was right next door in the Treasury Department. He brought in Dean Acheson as Secretary of State. And when the Korean War broke out, he fired the Secretary of Defense and brought General George Marshall, who had been really the organizer of the strategy and forces for World War II, back from retirement to be Secretary of Defense. And then he brought in Averell Harriman to work in the White House in what would appropriately be called, I think, a National Security Advisor today, because he was in charge of integrating the policies of the various departments and of the various allied countries. Harriman had wide experience with Russia, had been ambassador to Russia, had been involved in the Marshall Plan, had extensive contacts in Europe, was a very powerful personality, and played a role in this military buildup that was extremely important. He and Acheson tended to agree. Marshall had made a pledge that he would serve for a year, and then he was in increasingly poor health. He resigned. And Robert Lovett, who had been basically running the department as deputy secretary, stepped in, and Lovett and Harriman were old investment banking partners, neighbors, and very friends from childhood. And he and Acheson were fellow classmates at Yale and had known one another for a long time and had great respect for one another. So this team really saw to the buildup and gave the advice to Truman. And with only a few exceptions, Truman accepted it. But he always made clear that it was his decision to make on the major policy choices. But with the proper brief from his strong advisors, he generally accepted their direction. So that's a lot of what helped them. And as I point out in the book, but I haven't referred to today, the backdrop for all of this in terms of Washington decision-making is McCarthyism. And Senator McCarthy had been on a rampage at the very time the country was coming to its decision to contest the invasion, to have the big buildup and so forth. And a lot of this, it's not talked about, you don't find it in the documents, but it has to be, and certainly is, you get from oral histories and other things. The thing in the back of the minds of everyone, you can't appear weak before the Soviet challenges in Europe. And it was clear that Europe was the Soviet Union's first priority. Asia had always been a sideshow. And the Chinese now were essentially endorsed to take main leadership there in terms of the Paul Mill decisions. So McCarthyism is a silent factor in the decisions, and part of what was so instinctive for Truman to say, we have to stand up, we have to support the South Koreans. He didn't want to appear weak there, and basically it was probably a good decision. But it came with political costs, and obviously Eisenhower got elected in a landslide in the election of 1952.
Let me ask you, Sam, with regard to, because as you say, you have a whole chapter in the book looking at the context of McCarthyism, the impact of McCarthy. How would you say, this was also a very negative time in the Soviet Union. You know, there was a xenophobic and anti-Semitic campaign underway. Do you think that the domestic politics in communist countries also affected it? That is, was Stalin, do you think, affected as well, that given he was becoming increasingly paranoid and murderous toward his own population, that do you think that may have shaped some of his decisions about Korea as well? And the same I should add about China, although in China it was a much newer regime, so I want to leave aside China for right now.
China's a complex enough story on its own, and we're lucky to have gotten a fair number of documents there to have a much better reading of the Chinese decision making than we had 15 years ago. I think the Soviet strategy basically stayed pretty much the same. It still revolved around control of Eastern Europe and anchored in East Germany. And even when you get, after Stalin's death, a troika for a time, which decides to force the ending of the drawn out armistice negotiations, called a stop to the war. Khrushchev in particular pushed very hard for missile development and really took this on as a major enterprise. So there were not popular pressures because the lid was too tight for that. I mean, they weren't having anything like these demonstrations you see today. But what's one of the most interesting things is the people who were the really talented engineers, designers, physicists, metallurgists, by and large, the ones running these programs were not members of the party. Tupolev eventually joined the party, and later on, so did Kurchatov, but they didn't start off that way. And Tupolev, as I explained in the book, with all of his team in 1937-38, served a long period in prison, just in one of the earlier purges. So he was wary of Stalin, and then of course you've got Beria as the supervisor for both the bomber and the nuclear weapons program, and everybody knew his first resort, if he was having some difficulty, is to eliminate the person who was the problem. So they were, I mean, Tupolev stood up to Beria, and he was incredibly gutsy to, tell him what you want with this airplane won't work, and here are the figures to show it. And Beria eventually had to back down because, as Stalin said at one point, we need them now. We can shoot them later.
Let me emphasize for the audience who have not read the book that Tupolev's role is explained in a very interesting way among the many figures whose name might not be as familiar to a general audience. His role is brought out in an extremely interesting way in the book, both before the war and after. So anyone interested, for example, in Soviet aircraft or Soviet aircraft design or the rise of strategic bombers in the Soviet Union should really take a look at those aspects of the book. Let me turn to just to discuss the Chinese a bit, Sam, and the impact. And here I will pick up on one of the questions from the audience is that even though China gained certain things, particularly in standing in the communist world and in general in the global stature of great powers, it did lose one crucial thing, which was one of the reasons that Mao had been so hesitant before the war about giving his approval for it, which had to do with Taiwan. And he saw that as his first priority to reassert mainland control over Taiwan. He rightly foresaw that the war would deny him that objective, particularly when the US 7th Fleet intervened in the Taiwan Strait. And so here it is 70 odd years later, and China nowadays is still putting forth threats to reclaim Taiwan. Taiwan's a very different place now. It's a thriving, prosperous democracy. Back in 1949, 1950, it was a military dictatorship, very poor region. So how do you, I mean, in that respect, that was one very significant long-term cost for China. But more generally, how would you assess the longer-term impact of the war on China?
Well, one of the things that I had not understood until I really got into the documents and many of the writings, the Chinese, once they were in power, the communists really kept very good records, and you learn quite a bit about the relationship. I mean, Mao, unlike Stalin, Mao didn't go around hatching up false charges against his senior ministers and having them put on trial or put in prison for a time or whatever, or killed for that matter. He ran more of a government of equals, and particularly in the area of economics, because he, when you're dealing with a massive ego with Stalin and with Mao and Kim to a degree, but Kim had somewhat less reason to feel so strongly about his abilities. Mao read a tremendous amount. He knew a lot of political theory. He was reasonably well acquainted with the types of strategy and tactics that were needed. The one area that he confessed from the start that he knew very little about and he left to others was economics. And so he sort of seized for himself control of the military commission. And it was that commission that he concentrated on. And his right-hand man in running it was Zhou Enlai. And they essentially shaped things. And on the Formosa question, that was to be their top priority once they gained control of all of their own territory. You see, in the spring of 1950, the communists were really not in control of most of the northwest of the country, where they are still having some difficulty with the Uyghurs and some of the other ethnic groups. But they also didn't have really control of the cities, and particularly Shanghai. So they had a huge job to do of taking over. They tried initially working with essentially businessmen and middle class people, but they found these people wouldn't take instruction or orders very easily. And so they ended up pushing them aside. But when it came to Formosa, by the time the Soviets were more in control of the cities and thought they could leave maybe the west and northwest for some time later or for a more gradual conquest, the endorsement of the Korean invasion had already occurred. And Mao doesn't find out about this until Kim comes to visit him in May. So at this point, it becomes, and the other thing that is interesting is that at the urging of the Koreans, the Soviets did not send these massive supplies to Korea by rail, because that would have had to cross Manchuria. They sent it by sea. And the Chinese didn't know that all these weapons and supplies, which they were hoping to get for an invasion of Taiwan, were going to Korea. So by the time Kim comes with his announcement that he's got the endorsement of Stalin to invade South Korea, and Zhou Enlai gets in touch with Stalin and says, "What's going on? What have you promised?" etc. And then they start fleshing out the terms of what indeed had been promised. They learn that there are no supplies there. That Formosa's a non-starter at this point. They can't get the equipment that they need to do it. So Mao, while he's viewed in many ways as an ideologue, he also had a practical side. If that wasn't going to work, he just put it aside. And he started thinking about, okay, what does Korea mean? What does it mean for us? What does it mean to control of Manchuria, et cetera? And this is where we find out that in July, he decides we're going to have to be involved in Korea. And he and Zhou Enlai start transferring parts of their best armies to Manchuria and form the Northeast Defense Force. And eventually they've got 20 divisions there. And by the start of their invasion of the war, they had 800,000 troops at least in Manchuria. So Formosa's put on the shelf for a time, but they wanted to come back to it. And I have personal memories of the time when they did in the Taiwan Straits crisis in 1958-59, when I was serving in the Marine Corps in Hawaii. And we spent 2 nights sleeping on the tarmac at Hickam Air Force Base to go over and defend Taiwan. Formosa, it was then called. And at that point, I'm not sure I could have found it on a map, but I had combat maps that were supposedly useful if we ended up on that island. So, you know, that's periodically happened, but they, as you say, Taiwan is a totally different place than it was then. And a lot of that has happened in the last 20 years. So I mean, China basically strengthened and advanced itself. And one just other point I would mention is that when the Chinese entered the war, they made it a huge propaganda exercise to present it as the war to aid Korea and defeat American aggression. And they emphasized how much the Koreans had aided them in the Civil War. And they did a real stirring up of nationalism. And using this, they went into their own Northwest and into the cities and eliminated a lot of the potential opposition. So what the war provides is a cover to essentially clean out opponents. That's a story that really hadn't been told. And obviously it's hard to get documentation about it. I don't think those files will be open for a very long time. But there are foreigners who were there. You find hints of this in the oddest places. In Albania, which ended up being best friend of China and Europe. And the Albanian archives had a huge amount of reports from Beijing and so forth in them. East German archives had a lot of reports from some very good ambassadors in Beijing. So you find out a number of things literally by the back door.
So let me ask you, Sam, with regard to the Korean Peninsula, South Korea, like Taiwan, has emerged as a prosperous, thriving democracy over the last 30 years or so. And whereas North Korea remains as tyrannical as ever. And China is not as repressive as it was under Mao, but it remains a repressive dictatorship. Why do you think it is that that there's been, in many respects, so little political change, especially in North Korea? Or, for example, is Kim Jong Un just the latest? I mean, he's a descendant of Kim Il Sung, but is it more than that? That there just continues to be in a dynastic state? How do you get change?
Well, that's a question that people who know a lot more about North Korea than I do are puzzled by. It's odd that this very hour, one of our scholars at the Wilson Center is one of the South Korea's top experts on North Korea. And he's giving a presentation on who rules North Korea and how do they do it. And that's got information that many people have never seen. I've read an outline of his talk, and it's got information that was new to me. And it's very interesting. I mean, Kim Jong-un, who could just on the face be dismissed as a overfed kid in over his head, is a very practical, well-trained person because he's been prepared with military tutors and people for years to take over. And he really understands that having a deliverable weapon system and a very good system at home to control dissent are the things he needs to have regime survival. So it's going to be very hard to change those things. The Korean people will have to somehow get the information and the moxie to do it. But the weak spot, obviously, is the economy. And he's trying to deal with that in a more intelligent way than his grandfather did. He's allowing private enterprise up to a point. He's encouraging innovation and taking many of the brightest students and putting them in a technical university so that they can become very advanced in technology and they can be developing their own software and everything. So he's doing a number of things that can potentially sustain him. And the only chance we have is offering to help him in his dual crises now that we share the same crises. They're the pandemic and economic distress, but we're better equipped to deal with them than he is. I mean, we can provide some easing of sanctions in return for caps on the nuclear program. And that's the ultimate goal. Getting there will require a lot of patience and some risk of getting promises broken because the North Koreans are very good and have a real track record for breaking promises. So it's a portfolio. I mean, people are looking at the new Biden administration and saying, what are the toughest things? And a lot of people are saying, well, there's Iran, there's Russian hacking. So I think a recent survey by the Council on Foreign Relations shows that people who know a good bit about various crises consider North Korea to be the most imminent threat of erupting and the hardest one to handle, manage in any satisfactory fashion. So.
Thank you, Sam. I'm gonna, unfortunately, we're rapidly running out of time. So I do want to leave at, for a final thing, but I have one substantive question I want to raise. This comes from the audience, although I think it's to anyone, either who has read their book or especially those who haven't read the book. How did the acquisition of these new archival documents change your view either of U.S. policy, which I hinted at before they did, or in general about the Korean War?
Well, changed it substantially. I mean, if you, the view that I came out of a study which had involved access to a lot of the classified records on American policy, decision-making, intelligence information, and so forth, with the belief that the structure of NSC 68 and its urging for a massive buildup and opposing the Russians at every point was excessive and poorly argued and unlikely to get more than maybe a couple million more to the defense budget, but no significant change. The Russian documents started to change my mind when I saw how much Stalin was investing in weapons, in supporting the various East European communist parties, in policies to probe and undermine U.S. influence around the world, and made me question the conclusion that the United States had done too much, that the response to the Korean War was, in military terms, excessive. And excessive probably in terms also of international commitments. I began to revise that fairly quickly. The Chinese documents accelerated and strengthened the shift, so that I became convinced that there really was a panic in Washington in the very end of November, the first third of December, 1949, or 1950, as a reassessment of our allies' commitment to a continued war, a war that was ostensibly now authorized to eliminate and destroy North Korean forces, period, and unify the peninsula. And the intent of the Russians and the Chinese to see it through. So this created, in combination, a fear that the whole thing could slide into World War III. And it turns out there are several entries in the documents, one in Truman's diary, writing to, saying we are very close to sliding into World War III. Another in a letter to one of his best friends that he writes somewhat casually to, given security concerns. And then you find that there is a Gallup poll that found that a majority of those people surveyed considered that World War III was a possibility. So that's how fearing the worst became a title.
Very good. Thank you, Sam. I have one last small question, but before I get to it, let me mention for the audience, the book, which is again about 600 pages, is an extremely illuminating and wonderfully written book. So the topics we've discussed today or other topics that people may be interested in about the Korean War and in general the Cold War from the late 40s on through the 50s and even beyond that. I really would strongly recommend the book. Columbia University Press is the publisher. It is readily available online from any major bookseller. Last point I want to ask about, Sam, has, well, it's only tangentially connected with the book, but you as a young boy have memories of the Korean War. I'm wondering how, thinking back all of that time, how did you expect as a boy that you might someday be writing about that war, or that how did it shape that as a very young person? How did, looking back now, with the passage of 7 decades, how do you think you assessed it then as compared to now?
Well, the Korean War occurred when I was in high school. And frankly, I didn't give it a lot of thought. My local newspaper in Reidsville, North Carolina, didn't carry much international news. And I didn't know people who were involved in the war. And I think I was probably more interested in girls and football than anything international, or even national politics for that matter. But this was a time when my parents and all of their friends were pretty well committed Democrats, and they sort of admired Truman for his spunk. And we had in North Carolina, obviously, there's significant military complex at Fort Bragg and Camp Lejeune, but I didn't really know people who were involved. I mean, in fact, the people that I knew who were involved were both doctors who worked in the Navy, and one had worked in a hospital ship off Korea. So that was an angle I later learned about. I don't think I really knew it at the time. I don't remember it being subject of discussion in groups where I would end up with my parents and some of their friends, which were frequently church-related groups, but it wasn't particularly an issue. It was something that had to be done. That's the way it was viewed, and can't be over soon enough type situation. Then, of course, fairly soon after that, I end up, in order to pay part of my college expenses, in the Naval ROTC. So I learned more about the Korean War in college than I had in high school by a long shot.
Very interesting. Okay, well, let me thank you very much, Sam, and I apologize to the audience members whose questions I did not get to. I think I got to most of them, but in any case, I do want to just mention in closing the title of the book, Fearing the Worst: How Korea Transformed the Cold War. Again, I would strongly recommend it as a rich, extremely well-written account of a formative period of the Cold War. And I particularly am delighted to have Sam complete that book as kind of the crowning moment of his academic career. And I really want to thank you for being here, Sam.
Well, thank you for hosting it. It's been very
good. And thank you all to all members of the audience.